Welcome back to Alberta Primetime. On the vocal point tonight, a government with an addiction. The substance is fossil fuels, and our province is hooked on their volatile revenues. That's how the University of Calgary School of Public Policy describes Alberta. But it has a 10-year plan out today to get us clean. Also tonight is our province's pipeline pinch, now a national threat. The Monday Money panel brings in Michael Ganley. He is editor of Alberta Venture magazine. Shafik Hirani is a director at Investors Group Calgary. And just hours after the release today of financial options for deficit-ridden Alberta, Professor Ron Kneebone from the University of Calgary. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Hi, Jennifer.
Ron, Albertans are bracing for a huge deficit in the Conservatives' new budget Thursday. Tell us about what you call an addiction.
Well, this is a research paper I've done with my colleague Margarita Gress. And what we've done is we've looked at the Alberta's budget over the past 30 years. And what's clear is that the province has an addiction to oil and gas royalties, that when royalty income is high, the government spending goes up, and when those royalties fall, their spending collapses. And it's an addiction because they're a slave to these royalties, and they have to get off this addiction.
What is the budget gap that you talk about, and how do you think its figures should change?
We define something called the budget gap, and it's a measure of how dependent the government is on oil and gas royalties to pay for things like health care and education and social assistance. And what we show is that that gap has grown enormously over the last 15 years. So much so that now spending on health care and education and social assistance is under threat whenever oil or gas prices fall. So what we've suggested is that the government reduce that dependence on oil and gas royalties and get it down to a manageable level.
And you actually give numbers about $4,300 per person, where you'd like it to be maybe $1,500 per person in 10 years. Michael, we've heard about the latest looming deficit. What else do you think that we might see Thursday, perhaps?
Well, I don't think we're going to see any great cuts or any great moves by the government in terms of changes to the tax system at this point. I think that'll come probably further down the road. They're going to try and deal with this and keep the political damage to a minimum for the time being.
So no real addressing of what Ron's report points out, in your mind at least. We'll see.
That's going to have to be longer term, I think, for the Tories to try and tackle that.
Shafik, where do government's toughest decisions lie? You're a financial advisor. What do the PCs need to do?
Yeah, you know, Premier Redford's got some really tough situations here and Doug Horton, the finance minister of Alberta, last year they had a $41 billion budget and a $41 billion in expenses and $40 billion in revenue. So they're a $1 billion deficit, and they were hoping to balance it. And it looks like this year they're going to come in. Some people are guessing $4 to $5 billion in another deficit. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not just a revenue issue; it's also an expense issue. And like the expenses are a little bit out of control. And what do you do to rein in these expenses when the volatility of the energy sector wreaks havoc? And I think the problem is we're estimating oil at a little bit of a higher rate than we're getting, and that can cause a little bit of a challenge. $1 drop is $200 million in expenses on the budget.
So, Ron, what are the options that you're outlining in the 10-year plan you released today?
Well, what we're emphasizing is that it's a mistake to try to rely on things that you cannot rely on. And the government cannot rely, as we just heard, on oil and gas prices. So we're trying to wean them off of that. Now, how do you do that? Well, of course, what that means is they have to reduce their dependence on oil and gas, and that means controlling their spending and perhaps raising extra revenues. And we present a lot of different options for doing this, between cutting spending a lot, cutting it quickly, cutting it slowly. Whether or not you deal with health care spending is a real issue for us. Health care spending over the last 10 years has been growing at a rate that will see it double every 20 years. Mm-hmm. That's even accounting for inflation. Mm-hmm. So we've got a lot of options. Some of them involve new sales taxes.
Sure.
Michael, Alberta Venture is constantly talking to movers and shakers in this province. What is the appetite for higher royalties, corporate or personal taxes, a sales tax? Surely at this point, Albertans can see the province's costs. We're a growing province. There's always hands out. But the needs don't align, the costs and the needs.
Yeah, it's still a very tricky one politically to get this kind of thing through. I think they'll start the discussion. I think there's a lot of discussions in the back rooms going on. I think a lot of people recognize the problem here and agree with Ron, generally speaking, that we should be, raising the revenues to meet our annual expenses without relying so much on our resource royalties.
Because, Ron, at some point, Albertans can't crucify a government that makes the tough choices. How do we overcome the political suicide of raising royalties or taxes?
I think you need to speak honestly with people and lay out the facts. And the facts are pretty easy to present. That we've become so dependent on oil and gas royalties, and we've experienced this so many times. That's the part that surprises me. People of a certain age will remember Premier Getty cutting spending by over $2,000 per man, woman, and child in the late 1980s because of a fall in oil prices. We'll remember Ralph Klein did the exact same thing in the mid-1990s because of a collapse in oil prices. So here we are again, where the government's lost a bunch of energy revenues, and we're once again faced with the prospect of dramatically cutting their spending. This is a repeat that we should stop repeating. We need to get our budget straight, and that involves some hard decisions.
And Shafik, another research group, the Parkland Institute, says raising corporate taxes and ditching Alberta's flat personal tax for one on a sliding scale would add $11 billion to government coffers without even creating provincial sales tax. Would we still be on the low end compared to other provinces?
No, that would push us a little bit ahead of Vancouver. When Premier Redford got into power, when they defeated the Wild Rose Party, they committed to no new taxes. So she's in a really bit of a predicament. Changing to progressive taxes wouldn't offset the tax burden. So would a provincial sales tax. A 5% provincial sales tax would eliminate that $5 billion deficit. But the problem is the voters may not like that. Yeah. And we have to do something. We have to address it. We'll see what the talk is on the budget on Thursday.
Next up, what else our panelists are watching for this week, and the latest on Alberta's pipeline shortage. How much worse could it get? What is it costing us now? Is it a national threat at this point?
Hair care services for Jennifer Martin provided by Charisma Hair Fashion.
Welcome back to Alberta Primetime. The cost of protests and delays for new Alberta pipelines is now an estimated $70 million a day in economic activity, $30 billion a year nationally. And the ever-slow U.S. approval of a big new route, Keystone XL, drags on. Michael, with the discount on Alberta oil now at about $28 a barrel because shippers must wait their turn on pipelines, is the U.S. State Department's findings Friday that Keystone will not spur more development in the oil sands going to help get Obama to approve this pipeline?
It definitely gives him some ammunition to go forward with on this point. He got some good backing. I look at the executive summary, and it has a lot of good information in it that I think should be convincing to anyone who wants to look at this sort of based on the facts that, yes, there's always a bit of a risk of pipeline leaks, but overall it's not a terrible risk, and then the contributions to climate change are negligible. The oil industry there's going to be an equilibrium in demand and supply of oil. That oil is going to be come from somewhere, and it's going to be burned in people's tanks and to heat their homes.
We'll see what the Washington protesters think in the end.
Yep.
Ron, even if the Alberta government can find solutions to its growing deficit, could the pipeline crisis, or even its possible resolution perhaps, make slowly beating Alberta's oil and gas revenue addiction that much harder?
Well, it's a tricky thing here that the government has the problem of relying too heavily on these sorts of revenues. If the Keystone project is resolved and it goes through and the government's revenues start to increase, is a potential negative effect of that. It takes the pressure off the government, and they can breathe a sigh of relief and say, phew, the revenue's coming back, now we don't have to get serious with spending control. But I think that's the real source of the problem, is they've let their spending get out of control.
Shafik, we've seen Premier Alison Redford and now Premier Brad Wall from Saskatchewan go to Washington to campaign for pipeline approvals as well. That Friday finding the new pipeline won't create more oil sands projects. How much optimism do you think that these things warrant?
Well, you know, this is a very big thing. This is on a 3 million barrel per day. This is 800,000 barrels per day distribution of heavy oil. So this Keystone pipeline is very monumental for Albertans, and you know, it represents about 20% of our outflow. That is expected to expected to come to fruition in about 45 days. So there's 45 days now for lobbyists to put their own rebuttals into this, and then President Obama is going to make a decision. That should close the disparity, the gap between the price of oil, the Western price, and the heavy oil price, that $28 disparity, which will increase the revenue. It's very positive news, and it does look positive, but we're still crossing our fingers.
Ron, when do we hit a pipeline breaking point with Imperial's Curl plant coming online shortly, adding 110,000 barrels a day, still needing to be shipped? Could refining here be gaining a business case?
Well, it's a bit outside my expertise to talk about this, but from the government's revenue projections, what's important for them is that more and more oil sands companies hit a trigger price, that they get a sufficient return on their investment on these hugely expensive plants, that they can start paying a higher royalty rate. One of the things the bitumen bubble has done is it's kept those companies from hitting that trigger price, and that's why the government's not collecting as much royalty income as they would.
Michael, what else are you watching this week? Tell us about the current and upcoming editions of Alberta Venture.
Sure, thank you. Well, right now we have Hunter Harrison on the cover from CP Rail. We dug into the whole story of what he did at CN, what he did at his previous railways, and now what he's trying to do at CP in terms of getting their operating ratios down, whether they'll be able to meet that. Coming up, we have a look at the energy industry, Alberta's biggest industry, in April, and a story on another possible tax, that is a price on carbon, looking at some momentum here in Alberta, nationally and internationally, to put a price on carbon.
Shafik, I know you're watching for housing stats, among other things, this week.
Yeah, housing is released by Stats Canada on Friday. We're hoping for 175,000 new home starts. Also on Friday is the U.S. Unemployment rate, and we're hoping for under 7.9%. If it is crossing that 8% psychological threshold, that could spur a downward hit in the stock markets. Two other things really quickly. China tomorrow is releasing their growth rate, and we're hoping for a 7.6% growth rate in China. And on Wednesday, 3 monetary policies are announced: Bank of England, European Community, the ECB, and Bank of Japan, and that should spur the currency markets.
Ron, no doubt what's biggest on your radar this week is Thursday's budget. Do you expect any surprises?
I don't know. It depends on what you're expecting. What I'm hoping for is for the government to give some indication that they're serious about solving their addiction on oil and gas royalties. And what would I be looking for here? I'd be looking for signs that they're trying to control the rapid increase in healthcare costs, trying to constrain the increases in their spending, which have been much too rapid over the past 10 years. If they step up and say that the solution is just more revenue, they're wrong, and I would not want to see that. They've got to make some effort to control their spending.
Thank you all for your time tonight. Michael Ganley is editor of Alberta Venture magazine. Shafik Hirani is a director at Investors Group Calgary, and Ron Kneebone is a professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary.